Is Medieval 3 actually confirmed? My friends, this might be the clue we've been waiting for, and it's making me extremely hyped. Yesterday, YouTuber Björn Rutter posted a very interesting photograph to say the least. Björn writes that he's doing motion capture for creative assembly, and as we can tell, he is not only on a horse, but he's holding what's supposed to be a shield in his left hand and a sword in his right. He says he's not allowed to say anything about the project, but I think the image itself speaks more than 1,000 words. And if you can hear the excitement in my voice, it's because this truly hypes me up for one reason in particular. I am fairly certain this has to be no other game than Medieval 3, and the reason for this is that Björn is not just a motion capture actor, but his main passion and specialty is literally medieval warfare. Björn is a trainer in fencing and sword techniques of the 16th century and works as an actual swordsmanship trainer. And by the way, while I have you here, only 8% of people watching this video are actually subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy my content guys, it would just mean so much to me if you took time to make a simple click and sub to the channel. It goes a long way in helping my content reach further, and hopefully also help you in knowing when there's new content to be enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it. I think we have 4 main points to suggest our next game is Medieval 3. First, we have the horse, famously ridden by knights during the era. Second, we have the sword and shield, although this may be a point of contention. As we see, the shield in particular is square-shaped, and the sword looks like a Roman gladius, meaning we might even be dealing with a Rome 3 here. But honestly, the shield and sword might just be generic motion capture tools that can be turned into anything, and since these tools have no motion, it's not exactly necessary for them to look exactly like the final product. I think Rome 3 is unlikely, even though I'd honestly be hyped for that as well. Number 3, and perhaps most importantly, is Björn himself. If you go watch his channel, which I think you should by the way because his videos are absolutely excellent and surprisingly chill and informative at the same time, we can see his knowledge of and dedication to medieval type fencing. Every one of his videos are dedicated to various types of fencing, whether we're talking long swords, flails, large battle swords, or even pole arms and halberds. If CA were to make a game focusing on a different time period entirely, it's hard to imagine why they would hire a medieval fencing specialist, and not one focusing on another period. I would imagine warfare in China or Japan was very different after all, and that other specialists would have been hired for that job. That's why I do not think this is motion capture for a game like 3K2. My only fear is that this somehow is motion capture made for some Warhammer 3 Empire update or something, since the Empire is closely based on a fantasy version of 16th century Germany. But that is so unlikely that I don't even know I'm saying this. I guess I'm just scared to have my heart broken. In his post, Björn is even specifically stating that this is for a new project, which he's not allowed to even talk about. And I believe this rules out a 3 Kingdoms 2, which we kinda already know about, and the Warhammer 3 update, which I don't think would have been classified as a new project. The fourth reason, which is unrelated to this post, is that CA hasn't really touched mainline historical Total War for literally 8 long years, not counting the more mythical or romantic entries of 3 Kingdoms and Troy. We could talk about what the exact reason for this has been, whether it's the success of the fantasy Warhammer games, and CA's hope to make it big with fantasy-inspired games elsewhere over pure history, or that they've deemed fantasy-type games to be more safe financial investments. If CA is returning to history, it would therefore make sense to have Medieval 3 be their grand return, as medieval-type games are probably the foremost safest bet in the genre. Look for example at Crusader Kings 3, which has been a massive success for Paradox at this point, or the latest entry in Age of Empires, which absolutely was a safe bet and returned to the most famous game in the AoE series. As we know, financial security and the imagined success of a project is massively important to game devs and publishers, and I think it absolutely makes sense to consider Medieval 3 the safest bet in this regard. I also think a Medieval 3 would make sense as a grand return, since the Medieval series is so highly loved by the fans and remembered fondly without any important negative baggage. This really does stand in contrast to the Rome series, which, unless we're talking the original Rome, still suffers from the PR disaster that was the launch of Rome 2, and honestly, even though I personally love it, Rome Remastered has not been universally adopted by the fans either. If we're talking gunpowder games, it's fair to say that Empire as well is one of the most controversial games in the series, and as with Rome 2, had a rather horrible launch and was sadly never fixed. All of these aspects, I believe, point straight at Medieval 3, which I believe CA knows that so many of the fans are clamoring for. The Medieval series is further the Total War series, which I believe is most in need of a modern refresh. Every other series, whether we're talking Shogun, Rome 2 and Rome Remastered, Empire, or the Warhammer series, do after all feel quite modern and do run very well on newer hardware. Medieval 2 in particular stands out here, which by now offers a very antiquated user experience in terms of the UI, resolutions, and controls. And even though I really love this game to death and back, it's just a pain to play right now, with perhaps my biggest complaint being that pushing the movement key just swings the campaign map so far away, it's impossible to comfortably move around the map. Now I do believe this is Medieval 3, but if it's not, it might be something very close, namely a 30 Years War game. And the reason for this is that Bjorn is a 16th century specialist after all, and even though the war occurred in the 17th century, I believe many of the techniques in the 16th century were similar and still used in the early half of the 17th, although I might be wrong here. Of course, another question is if we're dealing with an all-encompassing game or a smaller saga type game. If the former is the case, we could be dealing with a Medieval 3 or, if we really want to zoom in on Bjorn's 16th century expertise, a Renaissance/Reformation game, kind of similar in period to EU4, perhaps taking place from about 1400 to 1700, a 300-year time span which could make sense, especially due to the remaining prevalence of classing up-close warfare and the evolution of pike and shot warfare during this period. Kind of a game that could bridge Medieval 2 and Empire. It would be a bit more of a daring choice, I'd say, since CA has never really focused on this exact period, although Medieval 2 officially ends in 1530 and therefore touches on it ever so slightly. If we are talking a saga game, however, it could be a number of various titles. As we know, saga games are narrower, meaning this could deal with a game focusing on the 30 Years War on its own, perhaps even an Italian Wars game, which pits major powers like France, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian republics against each other in Italy, and I think this could be really interesting actually. We could potentially also be talking about a focused Ottoman-Habsburg war game, which we know began in the 16th century, or even intra-Holy Roman Empire wars like the Hussite War. It could potentially also be something like the 100 Years War, even though this would firmly be a medieval game at that point. Ultimately, I don't know exactly how much of Bjorn's expertise Creative Assembly has made use of, and how narrow his expertise is in terms of time periods. But from what I've gathered based on his YouTube channel, his talent is sizable and his knowledge deep of swordsmanship of this era. And after all, there are probably limits to how much motion capture they've done. What I mean by this is that I wouldn't be surprised if his knowledge extends to the wider later medieval period as well, or that he was hired for a specific part of the next game, not necessarily doing every motion capture role there. No matter what game we're talking about here, I truly think this is Medieval 3 or a medieval adjacent game. And honestly, as long as this game sees a return to familiar historical form from CA, I'd be more than happy. All I know is that this single photo sparked my hype for Medieval 3 more than ever, and just imagining what this game might look like is close to making me burst with hype. Alternatively, I'll just go cry in a corner if it turns out to be something completely different. As always, let me know your thoughts and speculations in the comments. What game do you think this is for? Do you believe I'm crazy? Do remember to leave a like and sub to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.